Thomas Webb stood frozen in the middle of the narrow canyon trail, his rifle slack in his hands, staring at what used to be his pack mule. The animal lay sprawled across the rocks, its throat torn open, steam still rising from the wound in the cold morning air. But that wasn't what made his breath catch. It was the tracks, dozens of them circling the carcass in the dust. Wolf tracks, yes, but also something else. Barefoot human prints, small ones, a child's. And they led straight into the cave mouth 20 yards ahead, where he could now hear it. A low, wet breathing sound, rhythmic and wrong, like something was sleeping just beyond the darkness. The howling he'd ignored all night, the one that didn't sound quite like a wolf, the one that seemed to be calling his name, had stopped 3 hours ago. He'd thought that meant safety. He realized now, as the sun caught the edge of something white and small near the cave entrance, a tiny human skull picked clean, that the silence was worse than any howl could ever be. What I'm about to tell you today will shake you. But first, tell me, where are you listening from? I love knowing which corner of the country you're joining me from. Drop it in the comments below. 3 days earlier, Thomas Webb had been a different man. He'd been the kind of cowboy who kept his head down, did his work, and didn't ask questions about things that weren't his business. He'd been trailing a small herd of cattle through the Dakota Territory, working for a rancher named Cowboy, who paid decent and didn't talk much. That suited Thomas just fine. He preferred silence to conversation, solitude to company. The prairie stretched out before him like an ocean of grass, and he moved through it the way a ship moves through water, steady, purposeful, alone. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning when he found the first dead calf. It was lying in a shallow ravine, half-eaten, its eyes still open and clouded over. Thomas crouched beside it, studying the tracks in the soft earth. Wolf prints, clear as day, but something about them felt wrong. They were too deliberate, too organized, circling the calf in a pattern that seemed almost ritualistic. Wolves hunted for food, not ceremony. He stood up, wiped his hands on his pants, and decided not to mention it to Cowboy. No sense worrying the man over one lost calf. The second calf disappeared that night. Thomas heard the commotion, the panicked lowing of the herd, the thunder of hooves. But by the time he grabbed his rifle and ran toward the sound, it was over. The herd had settled, nervous and skittish, bunched together like they were trying to hide from something. He searched the perimeter with his lantern, the flame guttering in the wind, and found drag marks leading west toward the hills. He followed them for a quarter mile before the trail vanished into rocky ground. No blood, no body, just gone. Cowboy found him the next morning, standing at the edge of camp, staring at the hills. The rancher was a thick-shouldered man with a gray beard and eyes that had seen too much weather. He rode up slowly, studying Thomas's face. 2 calves in 2 days, Cowboy said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded. Cowboy spat into the dirt. Wolves? Thomas hesitated. Maybe, he said. Cowboy's eyes narrowed. Maybe? Thomas looked back at the hills. The tracks are wrong, he admitted. Don't make sense. Cowboy was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, pack up. We're moving the herd east, away from here. Thomas wanted to argue, but something in Cowboy's voice stopped him. The old man was scared. They moved the herd that afternoon, pushing them hard across the open prairie. The cattle were restless, their eyes rolling white, tails switching nervously. Thomas rode drag, eating dust, watching the hills recede behind them. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt watched. The sun was a copper disk sinking toward the horizon, painting everything in shades of rust and shadow. He kept his rifle across his saddle, his finger near the trigger. The wind picked up, carrying a smell he couldn't quite place. Something wild and rank, like wet fur and old meat. That evening, Cowboy told him the story. They were sitting by the fire, the herd bedded down and quiet, when the old man finally spoke. 20 years ago, Cowboy began, staring into the flames. There was a family lived out here. Name of Pritchard. Man, woman, 3 kids. They had a little homestead in the foothills, tried to make a go of it farming. He paused, poured himself more coffee from the battered pot. One winter they didn't come to town, not for supplies, not for church, nothing. When spring came and they still hadn't showed, the sheriff rode out to check on them. Calloway's voice dropped lower. He found the cabin empty. No bodies, no blood, no sign of struggle. But the place had been lived in all winter. Food eaten, fire kept, beds slept in. Only thing was, whoever was living there wasn't the Pritchards. The furniture was all rearranged. There were bones stacked in the corners. Animal bones mostly, but not all. And on every wall someone had drawn pictures in charcoal. Pictures of wolves standing on two legs. Pictures of children with wolf heads. Pictures of things the sheriff couldn't even describe. Thomas felt cold despite the fire's heat. "What happened to the family?" he asked. Calloway shook his head. "Never found them. But people in town started seeing things, hearing things. Wolves that howled like they were trying to talk. Tracks that started as wolf prints and ended as human feet. And every few years someone else would go missing. Always near those hills." He looked up at Thomas, his face drawn and serious. "The Sioux have stories about those hills. They call them the changing grounds. Say there are spirits there that get inside you, make you into something else. Something that's neither wolf nor man." Thomas wanted to laugh it off. He was a practical man, a man of cattle and horses and things he could see and touch. But he remembered those tracks circling the dead calf. He remembered the drag marks that ended in nothing. And he remembered the smell on the wind, wild and wrong. "You believe that?" he asked. Calloway poked the fire with a stick, sending up sparks. "I believe in staying alive," he said, "and I believe in listening when the land tells you to leave." They sat in silence after that, watching the fire burn down to coals. The next morning, Thomas woke before dawn to the sound of singing. It was faint and far away, carried on the wind. A child's voice, high and sweet, singing a lullaby he almost recognized. He sat up in his bedroll, listening. The voice seemed to be coming from the west, from the direction of the hills they'd left behind. He looked around the camp. Calloway was snoring by the dead fire. The cattle were still bedded down, peaceful in the gray light before sunrise. He was the only one who heard it. Thomas stood up slowly, pulling on his boots. The singing continued, rising and falling like a bird's call. He couldn't make out the words, but something about the melody made his chest ache. It reminded him of his sister, who had died of scarlet fever when he was 12. She used to sing that same tune while doing her chores, her voice drifting through the house like smoke. He took a step toward the sound, then another. His rifle was still in his bedroll, but he didn't think to grab it. All he wanted was to hear the song more clearly, to understand what it was saying. He'd walked 50 yards from camp when Calloway's hand clamped down on his shoulder. Thomas jerked, startled, and the singing stopped abruptly. "Where the hell are you going?" Calloway demanded. His face was pale in the dawn light, his eyes wide. Thomas blinked, confused. He looked back at the camp, then at the distance he'd covered. He didn't remember deciding to walk. He didn't remember moving at all. "I heard singing," he said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, thick and slow. Calloway's grip tightened. "There ain't no singing," he said firmly. "We're breaking camp. Now." They rode hard that day, pushing the herd east toward the town of Redemption. Thomas kept looking back over his shoulder, scanning the empty prairie behind them. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Several times he thought he saw movement in the distant grass, low, loping shapes that vanished when he tried to focus on them. Once, he was certain he saw a figure standing on a rise about a mile back, small and dark against the sky. When he pointed it out to Calloway, the rancher just shook his head. "Keep moving," was all he said. They made camp that night in a dry creek bed, using the banks for shelter from the wind. Calloway posted Thomas on first watch while he got some sleep. Thomas sat with his back against the dirt wall, his rifle across his knees, watching the stars wheel overhead. The night was clear and cold, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache. The cattle were nervous, shifting and lowing softly. He could hear coyotes in the distance, their yipping calls echoing across the flats. But beneath that sound, or maybe woven through it, he heard something else. A howl, long and low and lonely, rising from the west. It didn't sound like a normal wolf howl. It had a quality to it that made Thomas's skin prickle. A pattern, almost like speech, like someone trying to form words with a throat that wasn't meant for talking. He stood up, straining to hear. The howl came again, closer this time. And this time he was certain it was saying his name. Thu Mass. Drawn out and strange but unmistakable, His name, carried on the wind from something in the darkness. Thomas's hands tightened on his rifle. He wanted to wake Calloway, but his feet wouldn't move. The howl came a third time, and now it seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. North, west, south, surrounding them. "Thu Mass, come, Thu Mass, come!" He felt pulled toward it, like a fish on a line. His boots scraped in the dirt as he took a step forward, then another. The logical part of his brain was screaming at him to stop, but his body wasn't listening. He reached the edge of the creek bed and started to climb out. A gunshot cracked through the night. Thomas jerked backward, stumbling, as the bullet hit the dirt 6 inches in front of his boot. He spun around to find Calloway standing there, rifle smoking, his face hard as stone. "Get back here," Calloway said. His voice was shaking. "Right now, Thomas, get back here." Thomas blinked, feeling like he was waking from a dream. The howling had stopped. The night was suddenly terribly silent. He climbed back down into the creek bed, his legs trembling. "They're calling you," Calloway said quietly. "That's how it starts. They pick someone and they call until you come. You can't fight it alone. It gets inside your head, makes you want to go to them." He grabbed Thomas by the shoulders, forcing him to meet his eyes. "You listening to me? You can't go toward those sounds. No matter what you hear, no matter who you think is calling you. It ain't real. It's them. And if you go to them, you won't come back as yourself." Thomas nodded slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. He'd been seconds away from walking out into the darkness, seconds away from whatever was out there waiting. They didn't sleep the rest of that night. They sat back to back, rifles ready, watching the darkness and listening. The howling didn't return, but something worse took its place. The sound of movement in the grass beyond the creek bed. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling their position. Sometimes they sounded like animals, four-legged and heavy. Sometimes they sounded like bare feet on hard earth. Thomas caught glimpses of shapes in the starlight, low shadows that moved wrong, too fluid and purposeful to be natural predators. Once, he saw eyes reflecting back at him from the darkness. They were yellow and bright, set in a face he couldn't quite make out. Then they blinked and were gone. Dawn came like a mercy. The moment the first gray light touched the horizon, the presence around them vanished. Thomas could feel it lift, like a weight removed from his chest. The cattle stopped their nervous shifting and began to graze. Birds started singing. The world returned to normal so quickly it felt like waking from a nightmare. He looked at Calloway and saw the same exhausted relief in the old man's face. Neither of them spoke. They just broke camp and started moving, pushing the herd hard toward Redemption. They reached the town by late afternoon. Redemption was a small collection of weathered buildings clustered around a dusty main street. A general store, a saloon, a church with a crooked steeple, and a dozen houses. Calloway sold the herd to a buyer there, taking a loss because he wanted to be done with the whole business. He paid Thomas his wages plus extra, then looked him in the eye. "You're a good hand, Thomas, but I can't ask you to stay on. Not after this. Whatever those things are, they've marked you. Best thing you can do is get far away from here and hope they forget about you." Thomas took the money and nodded. He wanted to argue, to say it was foolish superstition, but he couldn't. He'd heard his name on the wind. He'd felt the pull of that howling. Something had chosen him and he didn't know why. He bought supplies at the general store, food, ammunition, a new bedroll, and asked the proprietor about work heading east. The man, a nervous fellow with thinning hair, studied him carefully. "You been out near the foothills?" he asked. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. The proprietor's face went pale. "You got the look," he said quietly. "The marked look. I seen it before." "What look?" Thomas asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. The proprietor leaned across the counter, his voice dropping to a whisper. 2 months ago, a surveyor came through. Said he'd been working up in those hills, mapping for the railroad. He had that same look you got, like he ain't sleeping, like he's listening to something the rest of us can't hear. He stayed one night at the boarding house, and in the morning, he was gone. Left all his things, his money, everything. They found his tracks heading back west toward the hills, barefoot in the snow. Thomas felt ice in his stomach. They find him? The proprietor shook his head. Week later, some Sioux hunters found what was left, or what they thought was left. Hard to tell. The body was... He trailed off, swallowed hard. Changed. That's what they said. Changed. Like something had been working on it from the inside out, trying to make it into something else. He pushed Thomas's supplies across the counter. My advice? Get on a train and don't stop until you're 1,000 miles from here. And if you hear anything calling you at night, plug your ears and pray. Thomas left the store with his supplies and his dread. He stood on the wooden sidewalk, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. He could leave. He could get on the eastbound train tomorrow morning and never look back. But something in him resisted. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the pull that had already started working inside him. Whatever it was, he couldn't shake the feeling that running wouldn't help, that wherever he went, he'd still hear that howling. He'd still feel them calling. He spent that night in the saloon, drinking whiskey and trying not to think. The place was half empty, just a few local ranch hands and a poker game in the corner. The bartender was a big man with scarred knuckles who kept looking at Thomas like he was a ghost. Around midnight, an old Sioux man came in, his face weathered and creased like old leather. He sat down next to Thomas at the bar, ordered nothing, and just looked at him for a long moment. Then he spoke in English, his accent thick but clear. You have been chosen by the skinwalkers, he said. It wasn't a question. Thomas set down his glass. That what they're called? The old man nodded. They are spirits. Old ones from before the white man came, from before my people came. They lived in the spaces between wolf and man, never fully one or the other. They are always hungry. Hungry for form, for flesh, for someone to wear. He tapped Thomas's chest with one gnarled finger. They want you. They will call and call until you come. And when you come, they will take you apart piece by piece and put you back together as one of them. You will wear your own skin, but it won't be you inside anymore. How do I stop them? Thomas asked. The old man was quiet for a long time. Outside, a dog started barking, then abruptly went silent. The saloon suddenly felt very cold despite the fire in the stove. You can't, the old man finally said. Once they choose, they don't stop. You can resist, but they are patient. They will wait. They will call. And one night you will be too tired, too weak, too lonely, and you will answer. Everyone does in the end. He stood up, moving slowly, like his bones hurt. I'm sorry, he said. Then he walked out into the night, leaving Thomas alone with his whiskey and his fear. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He sat in his rented room at the boarding house, his rifle across his lap, listening. Around 3 a.m, he heard it, faint and far away, barely audible through the closed window. A child singing, that same lullaby, his sister's song. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressed his hands over his ears, but he could still hear it. It seemed to be coming from inside his own head now, echoing in his skull. Come home, Thomas, come home. Come home. The voice sounded so much like her, so much like the sister he'd lost 20 years ago. He found himself standing, found his hand on the doorknob. He forced himself to stop, to breathe, to think. His sister was dead, had been dead for decades. This was something else, something wearing her voice like a mask. He backed away from the door, sat down hard on the bed, and waited for dawn. The singing continued until the first light touched the window. Then it stopped, as suddenly as if someone had shut a door. Thomas sat there shaking, exhausted, knowing that he'd come within seconds of opening that door, within seconds of walking out into the darkness and letting them have him. By morning, Thomas had made his decision. He wasn't going to run. Running meant living the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, waiting for the call to come. He'd rather face whatever was out there, understand it, maybe even find a way to break free of it. It was probably foolish, probably suicidal, but it was the only choice he could live with. He packed his supplies onto a mule he bought from the livery stable, checked his rifle and revolver, and headed west, back toward the hills, back toward whatever was calling him. The ride took most of the day. The land changed as he traveled, becoming rougher and more desolate. The grass gave way to rocky ground and twisted juniper trees. The sky seemed bigger here, emptier, like God had stopped paying attention to this particular corner of creation. Thomas saw no other travelers, no homesteads, no signs of human life, just the wind and the rocks and the feeling of eyes watching him from places he couldn't see. His mule grew increasingly nervous, its ears flicking back and forth, its nostrils flaring at scents Thomas couldn't detect. Around noon, he found the remains of the Pritchard homestead. It sat in a shallow valley, sheltered by low hills on 3 sides. The cabin was still standing, barely, its roof sagging, its windows dark and empty like the eye sockets of a skull. The door hung open on broken hinges. Thomas dismounted, tied his mule to a dead tree, and approached slowly. The wind made a hollow sound blowing through the empty structure, like breath through a broken flute. He could see marks on the door frame, deep gouges that might have been made by claws or knives. Inside, the cabin was exactly as Calloway had described. The furniture was rearranged in strange configurations, chairs stacked on tables, the bed frame leaning against the wall at an angle, and the drawings were still there, faded but visible on the weathered wood. Wolves standing upright, children with animal heads, figures that seemed to be caught mid-transformation, neither fully human nor fully beast. Thomas ran his fingers over one of the charcoal marks and felt a chill run through him. These weren't the work of madness. They were too precise, too deliberate. They were instructions or warnings. In the corner of the room, he found bones. They were arranged in patterns, spirals and circles and symbols he didn't recognize. Some were animal bones, deer and rabbit and bird. But some were human, a child's femur, a woman's rib cage, the bones yellowed with age, a skull cracked open, with strange markings carved into the forehead. Thomas backed away, his stomach turning. He'd seen death before, had even dealt it when necessary, but this felt different. This felt profane. This felt like something sacred had been violated and twisted into something unholy. He left the cabin and searched the surrounding area. Behind the structure, he found what looked like graves, 3 of them unmarked, just mounds of disturbed earth. But when he dug into one with his hands, he found nothing. The hole was empty, going down several feet before hitting bedrock. Empty graves, or graves that had been dug up from the inside. He sat back on his heels, breathing hard, trying to make sense of it. Then he heard the sound, a low whimper, like a child crying, coming from the hills to the north. Thomas grabbed his rifle and followed the sound. It led him up a narrow trail, winding between boulders and scraggly pines. The whimpering continued, always just ahead, drawing him deeper into the hills. He knew it was a trap. He knew he should turn back. But the sound was so pitiful, so genuinely distressed that some part of him couldn't help responding. What if there really was a child out here, lost and alone? What if someone needed his help? He climbed higher, his boots slipping on loose scree, his breath coming hard in the thin air. The trail opened onto a small plateau, and there, sitting on a flat rock in the center of the space, was a little girl. She looked about 7 years old, with tangled blonde hair and a dirty white dress. She was crying, her face buried in her hands, her small shoulders shaking. Thomas stopped, his rifle half raised, every instinct screaming at him that this was wrong. Children didn't survive alone in these hills. Children didn't sit perfectly still while crying. And yet, she looked so real, so vulnerable. He took a step closer. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. The girl's crying stopped. Slowly, she lowered her hands and looked at him. Her eyes were yellow, bright, animal yellow, like a wolf's eyes catching lamplight. And when she smiled, her teeth were too sharp, too many, filling her mouth like broken glass. "Hello, Thomas," she said. Her voice was wrong, too deep, layered, like multiple voices speaking in unison. "We've been waiting for you. We've been calling and calling. Why did you take so long to come home?" She stood up, and Thomas realized with horror that her movements were too fluid, too smooth, like she had too many joints in her limbs. Thomas raised his rifle, his hands shaking. "Stay back," he said. The thing wearing the girl's shape tilted its head, studying him with those yellow eyes. "You can't hurt me with that," it said. "I'm already dead. We're all already dead. We died a long time ago, but the spirits wouldn't let us rest. They took us, Thomas, they took us and made us into something new, something better, and now we want to share it with you." It took a step toward him, and Thomas saw that its bare feet didn't quite touch the ground. It was floating, just an inch above the rocky surface. He fired. The bullet hit the thing in the chest and it staggered backward, a look of surprise crossing its face. But there was no blood. The hole in its dress showed pale skin beneath, unmarked and smooth. The thing looked down at itself, then back up at Thomas, and laughed. It was a terrible sound, high and hysterical and full of genuine amusement. "See?" it said. "You can't stop us. You can't fight us. We're already inside you, Thomas. We've been inside you since the first time you heard us call. Every night you listen, we get stronger. Every night you resist, you get weaker. It's only a matter of time." Thomas turned and ran. He crashed back down the trail, his rifle forgotten, his only thought to get away from that thing and its yellow eyes. Behind him, he could hear it laughing, the sound echoing off the rocks, multiplying until it seemed like a dozen children were laughing at him from all directions. He reached his mule, untied it with fumbling hands, and rode hard back toward the valley. The laughter followed him for miles, fading only as the sun began to set. He didn't stop until he was 5 miles from the homestead, his mule lathered with sweat and his own heart pounding like a drum. That night, Thomas made camp in a ring of stones. He'd heard that fire and iron could ward off evil spirits, so he built the biggest fire he could manage and laid his rifle and knife within arm's reach. He didn't sleep. He sat watching the darkness beyond his firelight, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. Around midnight, he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling his position. Sometimes they sounded like a person walking. Sometimes they sounded like an animal on 4 legs, but they never came close enough for him to see what was making them. "Thomas." The voice came from the darkness, soft and feminine. His mother's voice. "Thomas, why are you out here? Why aren't you home with your family?" He gripped his rifle tighter, refusing to respond. "Thomas, I'm cold, so cold. Won't you come warm me?" The voice changed, became younger. His sister. "Tommy, I'm scared. There are things in the dark. Please don't leave me out here alone." He squeezed his eyes shut, jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Not real. None of it was real. Then another voice joined in. A man's voice, deep and authoritative. His father, who died in the war. "Son, I need you. I'm hurt, I can't walk. Please help your old man." And another voice, his childhood friend who'd drowned in a river. His first love who'd married another man. His commanding officer from the army. Every person he'd ever cared about. Every voice he'd ever trusted calling to him from the darkness, begging him to come, promising him it would be all right if he just stepped out of the firelight, just came to them, just let them help him. Thomas put his hands over his ears and screamed. He screamed until his throat was raw, until the voices finally faded into silence. Then he sat there, shaking, tears running down his face. He understood now why people gave in. The loneliness of resisting was worse than any physical pain. The isolation of being the only one who wouldn't answer was unbearable. Part of him wanted to give up, to walk into that darkness and let whatever was going to happen just happen. At least then it would be over. At least then he wouldn't be alone anymore. But dawn came, as it always did, and with the light, Thomas felt something shift inside him. Anger. Hot, clean anger at these things for using the voices of people he'd loved, for twisting his grief and loneliness into weapons against him. They wanted him weak and afraid. Fine. He'd been weak. He'd been afraid. But he was also angry now, and anger was something he could use. He stood up, kicked dirt over his fire, and started planning. If he couldn't fight them directly, he'd have to find another way. He rode back to Redemption, arriving just after noon. He went straight to the church, figuring a man of God might have answers that ordinary folk didn't. The priest was a thin, severe man named Father Morrison, with sunken cheeks and eyes that had seen their share of prairie darkness. Thomas told him everything. The calls, the visions, the thing that looked like a little girl. Father Morrison listened without interruption, his face growing graver with each detail. When Thomas finished, the priest was quiet for a long time. "I've heard stories like yours before," Father Morrison finally said. "Always about those hills. The church doesn't officially recognize such things as demons in the classical sense, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There are old evils in this world. Things that existed before Christ, before civilization, before man learned to fear God instead of the dark. The natives understood this. They knew there were places where the boundaries were thin, where things could cross over. Those hills are one such place." Thomas leaned forward. "Can you help me? Is there a ritual?" An exorcism, something. Father Morrison shook his head slowly. Those things only work on demons. What you're dealing with is something else. Something older. But he stood and walked to a shelf, pulling down a worn leather journal. A priest came through here 30 years ago. He'd been a missionary to the Sioux, learned their ways, their stories. He wrote about the skinwalkers, said they were spirits of wolves that had eaten human flesh and gained a taste for it. They wait in certain places, hunting grounds where they once fed, and they call to people, lure them in, take their shapes. How do you stop them? Thomas asked. Father Morrison flipped through the journal, found a page, and read aloud. The Sioux believed that skinwalkers could be destroyed, but only by someone who had been called by them and resisted, someone they'd marked but not claimed. That person had to return to the skinwalker's den, where they first died, where their bones lay, and burn those bones while speaking the names of the dead. It would release their spirits and destroy the skinwalkers that had taken their forms. He looked up at Thomas. But the journal says it's nearly impossible, because the closer you get to their den, the stronger their call becomes. Most people can't resist long enough to complete the ritual. Thomas stood up. Where's their den? Father Morrison closed the journal. The priest didn't know exactly, but he said it would be marked. A cave or hollow where you'd find bones and the signs of their presence, and you'd know it because the pull would be strongest there. You'd want to go in more than you'd ever wanted anything. He grabbed Thomas's arm. Don't do this, leave this place. Those things have killed before, they'll kill again. One more lost soul won't make a difference. Thomas pulled free. It'll make a difference to me, he said. He bought supplies for the ritual, coal oil for burning, matches, rope. The store owner watched him with sad, knowing eyes but didn't ask questions. Thomas also bought a bottle of laudanum from the doctor, enough to dull his senses if the call became too strong. He wasn't proud of it, but survival wasn't about pride. It was about doing whatever it took to see another dawn. He packed everything onto his mule and headed west again, this time with a purpose. This time with a plan that would probably get him killed. The hills welcomed him back like an old friend. The wind picked up as he rode, carrying scents of sage and something darker, something rotting. His mule balked several times, refusing to go forward until Thomas dismounted and led it by hand. The sun was setting as he reached the valley, painting the sky in shades of blood. Thomas could feel it now, the pull, like hooks in his chest, tugging him north toward the higher hills. He knew that's where the den would be, where the bones waited, where they were waiting. He left his mule tied at the abandoned homestead and continued on foot, carrying his rifle, a torch, the coal oil, and the laudanum. The trail was harder to follow in the twilight, but he didn't need to see it. He could feel it. Every step northward felt right in a way that terrified him. His body wanted to go faster, wanted to run toward whatever was calling. He forced himself to walk slowly, to breathe, to think. He was Thomas Webb. He was his own man. These things didn't own him, not yet. The trail led to a narrow canyon he hadn't noticed before. Its walls rose 50 feet on either side, blocking out the last of the daylight. Thomas lit his torch and moved forward, the flame casting wild shadows on the stone. The canyon floor was littered with bones. Animal bones mostly, but he spotted human remains too. A skull here, a pelvis there, all old and weathered. The wind through the canyon made sounds like whispers, like voices too soft to understand. The pull was stronger now, almost physical, like hands on his back pushing him forward. At the end of the canyon was a cave mouth. It was wide and dark, exhaling cold air that smelled of earth and death. Thomas stopped at the entrance, his every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But he could see bones scattered just inside the cave. Fresh bones, and among them, half buried in the dirt, a child's dress. The same dirty white dress the thing on the plateau had been wearing. This was it. This was their den. This was where the Pritchard family had died, where the skinwalkers had been created, where they'd waited for decades to claim new victims. Come in, Thomas. The voice echoed from deep in the cave. His sister's voice again. We're waiting. We're all here, everyone you ever loved. Don't you want to see us? He could see movement in the darkness beyond his torchlight. Multiple figures standing just out of sight. Come home, they said in unison. Come home, Thomas. Come home. The pull was overwhelming now. He felt his feet moving forward, his body obeying the call despite his mind screaming at him to stop. He fumbled for the laudanum with shaking hands and drank half the bottle in one swallow. The drug hit him fast, making the world swim and blur. The voices became distant, muffled, like he was hearing them underwater. The pull weakened, became manageable. Thomas forced himself to think clearly. He had to burn the bones while speaking the names of the dead, but he didn't know their names. Father Morrison's journal hadn't said. He stood at the cave entrance, swaying, trying to understand what to do. Then he remembered the graves behind the homestead. Maybe there were markers, maybe the names were written somewhere. He turned to go back, and that's when they came out of the cave. There were 5 of them. The little girl he'd seen before. A woman in a torn dress, her neck bent at an impossible angle. A man with no eyes, just empty sockets that somehow still saw. And 2 children, a boy and a girl, holding hands, their skin gray and stretched tight over their bones. They moved wrong, jerking and flowing at the same time, like puppets controlled by something that didn't understand how human joints worked. They circled him slowly, their yellow eyes fixed on his face. "You drank the sleeping medicine," the little girl said, her voice disappointed. "That's cheating." "We can wait," the eyeless man said. "The medicine will wear off, and when it does, you'll hear us again, and you'll come to us. They always do." The woman with the broken neck smiled, her head lolling to the side. "We've been so lonely, Thomas. So lonely for so long. The Pritchards were the last. That was 20 years ago. We need new family. We need you." The 2 children moved closer, reaching out to touch him. "Stay with us," they whispered. "Forever and ever. We'll never be alone again." Thomas swung his torch at them, and they scattered backward with hisses of anger. Fire. They didn't like fire. He pulled out a match, struck it, and held it up. "Stay back," he said, his voice slurred from the laudanum. "Stay back or I'll burn this whole canyon." The little girl laughed. "Burn it. We'll just move to another place. We've moved before. We'll move again. But you, Thomas, you can't run from us. We're in your head now, in your dreams. You're already ours. You just don't know it yet." The match burned down to his fingers, and he dropped it with a curse. What would you have done in his place? Imagine being chosen by something you couldn't fight, couldn't escape, that knew your every weakness and used the voices of everyone you loved against you. Tell me, have you ever felt trapped by something you couldn't name? Something that called to you even when you knew it would destroy you? Think about it while we continue. Thomas stumbled backward, his mind racing. The laudanum was making it hard to think, but one thing was clear. He needed the names. Without the names, he couldn't complete the ritual. He couldn't free their spirits. He couldn't destroy them. He backed slowly down the canyon, keeping his torch between him and the 5 figures. They followed, moving with that wrong, jerking gait, always staying just at the edge of the light. "Where are you going, Thomas?" they called. "There's nowhere to run. This is your home now. Accept it." He reached the canyon mouth and ran. The laudanum made him clumsy, made his legs feel like they belonged to someone else, but fear pushed him forward. Behind him, he could hear them following. The sound of bare feet on stone. The sound of something that walked on 2 legs but shouldn't. He reached the homestead as full darkness fell, fumbled with his tinderbox and lit a lantern. Then he ran to the graves behind the cabin, falling to his knees, digging with his bare hands in the dirt. The first grave was empty, as he'd found before, but in the dirt at the bottom, his fingers found something, a wooden cross, fallen and buried. He pulled it out, held it up to his lantern. Carved into the wood, barely legible, were the words, "Sarah Pritchard, beloved mother." His hands shaking, he dug into the second grave. Another cross, "John Pritchard, father and provider." The third grave, "Emma, David, and Rebecca Pritchard, taken too soon." 5 names, 5 graves, 5 skinwalkers. He had what he needed. Thomas stood up, clutching the wooden crosses, and turned to find them standing in a semicircle behind him. All 5 of them, their yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. "You found our names," the woman, Sarah, said softly. "You found what we used to be called, before we became what we are now." The eyeless man, John, tilted his head. "Do you really think speaking those names will free us? We don't want to be free. We like what we've become. We're powerful now. Eternal. We'll never die again, we'll never suffer again." "You're already dead," Thomas said. "You're twisted, wrong versions of what you were, Let me help you. Let me give you peace." The three children, Emma, David, and Rebecca, moved closer. "We don't want peace," they said together. "Peace is boring, peace is empty, this is better. Being able to call across the darkness, being able to take new shapes, being able to feed." David smiled, showing those too many teeth. "And we're so hungry, Thomas. We've been hungry for 20 years. We want to feed, we want to taste flesh again, your flesh." They rushed him, all five at once, moving impossibly fast. Thomas threw himself backward, landing hard on his back, the lantern flying from his hands and shattering. The coal oil spilled across the ground, catching fire instantly. Flames leaped up, creating a barrier between him and the skinwalkers. They shrieked and pulled back, their gray skin smoking where sparks landed. Thomas scrambled to his feet, grabbed one of the burning pieces of wood from the fire, and ran, back toward the canyon, back toward their den. This was his only chance. He had the names. He had fire. If he could reach the bones and burn them while speaking the names, it might work. It might end this. The canyon was pitch black now, but Thomas didn't need light. His feet knew the way, drawn by that terrible pull that even the laudanum couldn't fully suppress. He could hear the skinwalkers behind him, screaming in rage and hunger. He reached the cave mouth, stumbled inside, and there were the bones. Piled in the center of the cave, dozens of them, yellow and ancient in the light of his makeshift torch. Human bones and wolf bones, mixed together in a profane heap. The remains of the Pritchards and the wolves that had consumed them, merged into something new. Thomas poured the remaining coal oil from the can he'd dropped earlier over the bones. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the torch. The skinwalkers appeared at the cave entrance, their forms silhouetted against the lesser darkness of the night sky. "Don't do this," Sarah begged. "Please, we'll leave you alone. We'll never call you again. Just don't take this from us. Don't send us back to death." Thomas looked at her, at the thing wearing her face, and felt something like pity. But pity wouldn't save him. Only fire would. He dropped the torch onto the bones. The coal oil caught instantly, flames roaring up in a brilliant pillar of light and heat. The skinwalkers screamed, a sound so terrible it seemed to shake the very walls of the cave. Thomas forced himself to speak over their screaming, shouting the names as loud as he could. "Sarah Pritchard, John Pritchard, Emma Pritchard, David Pritchard, Rebecca Pritchard, I release you. I free you, go to your rest." The flames burned hotter, brighter, turning the bones to ash. And the screaming changed. It became lighter, higher, almost relieved. The sound of souls released from prison. One by one, the skinwalkers fell apart. Their bodies dissolved like smoke, their yellow eyes fading to nothing, their screams becoming whispers and then silence. The little girl was last. She looked at Thomas with something like gratitude in those terrible eyes before she came apart, her form scattering on a wind that didn't exist. And then they were gone, all of them. The cave was empty except for Thomas and the burning bones and the smell of fire and old death. He collapsed against the cave wall, exhausted, his whole body shaking with relief and shock and the fading effects of the laudanum. He stayed there until the fire burned itself out, until the bones were nothing but ash, and the cave was cold and empty again. Then he walked out into the night and found it different somehow, cleaner. The oppressive weight that had hung over the hills was gone. The wind no longer whispered with voices. The darkness was just darkness, natural and ordinary, and blessedly empty. Thomas walked back to the homestead, found his mule still waiting where he'd tied it, and headed east, away from those hills, away from that cursed valley, away from the place where 5 people had died and become something worse than death. Thomas rode through the night, putting as much distance as he could between himself and those hills. His body ached from exhaustion. His mind was foggy from the laudanum, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until he was certain they were truly gone. The moon rose full and bright, turning the prairie into a silver ocean, and for the first time in days, Thomas found the beauty in it instead of the threat. The night was just night again. The shadows were just shadows. He breathed deeply, tasting the cold air, feeling truly alive for the first time since this had all begun. Dawn found him 10 miles east of the valley, sitting by a small creek letting his mule drink. His hands were blistered from digging, his clothes reeked of smoke and fear sweat, and his face was hollow with exhaustion. But he was free. He could feel it in his bones. The pull was gone. The hooks that had been tugging at his chest had vanished. When he closed his eyes, he heard nothing but the wind and the water. No voices, no singing, no calls from the darkness. He allowed himself to feel relief, though it came mixed with something else. Grief, maybe, or guilt. He'd destroyed those things, but they'd once been people. A family, victims themselves. He thought about Sarah Pritchard, standing in that cave, begging him not to send them back to death. The fear in her voice, or the thing that had been her voice, had been real. Whatever they'd become, they'd been terrified of losing it, of going back to nothingness. Thomas wondered if he'd done the right thing, burning their bones, ending their twisted existence. But then he remembered the empty graves, the bones arranged in patterns, the child's skull at the cave entrance. They'd been suffering, yes, but they'd also been making others suffer. Sometimes mercy meant ending something, even if that something was afraid to die. He reached redemption by late afternoon. The town looked different in the daylight, smaller, more ordinary, less like a sanctuary and more like what it really was, a collection of weathered buildings trying to pretend civilization had reached this far west. Thomas went straight to the church. Father Morrison was in the garden behind the building, tending to a small plot of vegetables. When he saw Thomas, he dropped his trowel and stood up slowly, his eyes widening. "You're alive," he said. It sounded like an accusation and a prayer at the same time. "Barely," Thomas replied. He dismounted, his legs nearly giving out. Father Morrison caught him, helped him to a bench. "I did it," Thomas said. "I found their den, found the names, burned the bones. They're gone." Father Morrison stared at him for a long moment, then crossed himself. "Blessed Mary," he whispered. "In 30 years of hearing confessions in this territory, I've never once had someone come back from those hills unchanged. Most don't come back at all." He gripped Thomas's shoulder. "You're a braver man than most, or a more foolish one. I'm not sure which." Thomas smiled weakly. "Probably both." He told the priest everything, the confrontation with the skinwalkers, the crosses he'd found in the graves, the moment when Sarah Pritchard had begged him not to burn the bones. Father Morrison listened without interrupting, his face grave. When Thomas finished, the priest was quiet for a long time, staring at his garden like it held answers. "Do you think they're at peace now?" Thomas asked. "The real Pritchards, the people they used to be. Do you think what I did freed them?" Father Morrison considered the question carefully. "The journal said burning the bones would release their spirits," he finally said. "Whether that means peace or simply an end to their suffering, I can't say. But I believe, I have to believe, that God is more merciful than the darkness that claimed them. If there was anything left of their souls, anything that remembered being human, then yes, I think you freed them." He looked at Thomas. "And more importantly, you freed anyone else who might have heard their call. You broke a cycle of suffering that might have gone on for another 100 years. Thomas nodded, feeling some of the weight lift from his chest. He stayed with Father Morrison that evening, accepting the offer of a real bed and a hot meal. The priest's housekeeper, an old Mexican woman named Consuela, fussed over him like he was a lost child, bringing him soup and bread and strong coffee. She didn't ask questions, just patted his hand and murmured prayers in Spanish. Thomas ate slowly, savoring the simple human kindness of it. After days of hearing voices that wore familiar faces like masks, genuine human warmth felt almost miraculous. That night, Thomas slept without dreaming. No calls came from the darkness. No songs echoed in his head. He woke once around 3 in the morning with his heart pounding, convinced he'd heard his name whispered. But when he listened, there was only silence. Real silence. Empty and clean and blessed. He lay back down and fell asleep again. And when dawn came, he woke feeling more rested than he had in weeks. The shadows under his eyes had lightened. His hands were steady. He looked at himself in the small mirror over the wash basin and saw something he recognized. Himself. Just himself. No mark. No stain. Just a tired cowboy who'd survived something he shouldn't have. He left Redemption the next morning, heading further east. Father Morrison came out to see him off, pressing a small silver cross into his hand. "For protection," the priest said. "Though I suspect you won't need it. Whatever chose you, you beat it. That kind of strength, that kind of will, it leaves its own kind of mark. A good one." Thomas pocketed the cross, thanked the priest, and rode out. He looked back once, seeing the small town receding behind him, and felt a strange mixture of relief and melancholy. He was leaving behind the worst thing that had ever happened to him, but also the moment when he'd been strongest, most determined, most truly himself. The days that followed were quiet. Thomas traveled east through the territories, picking up odd jobs here and there. Fence mending, cattle driving, breaking horses. He kept to himself mostly, but he found he didn't mind human company as much as he used to. After facing something so profoundly inhuman, other people seemed less complicated, less threatening. He could sit by a campfire with other drovers and listen to their stories, their complaints, their jokes, and find comfort in the simple, messy, beautiful reality of human existence. People were flawed and foolish, and sometimes cruel, but they were also warm and real and wonderfully, blessedly ordinary. He made it to Kansas by late summer. The land there was different, flatter, greener, more civilized. He found work on a ranch outside of Dodge City, working for a widow named Margaret Keller, who ran her late husband's spread with an iron will and a kind heart. She asked him once about the scars on his hands, the ones from digging in the rocky soil. Thomas told her he'd buried something that needed burying. She'd looked at him for a long moment, then nodded and never asked again. Some stories, her silence seemed to say, were meant to stay buried. Fall came, bringing cooler weather and the sound of geese flying south. Thomas worked from dawn to dusk, losing himself in the rhythm of ranch work, feeding cattle, mending tack, riding fence lines. Simple physical labor that left him too tired to think much at night. He liked it that way. He liked coming back to the bunkhouse exhausted, eating a hot meal and falling asleep to the sound of other men snoring. It was ordinary and real, and after what he'd been through, ordinary felt like the greatest blessing God could give. One evening in late October, Thomas was sitting on the porch of the ranch house, mending a bridle, when a group of Sioux hunters rode past on the road. They were heading west, back toward their winter camps. One of them, an old man with long gray braids, caught sight of Thomas and pulled his horse to a stop. He stared for a long moment, his dark eyes searching Thomas's face. Then he nodded slowly, once, and raised his hand in what might have been a salute, or a blessing. Thomas raised his hand in return. The old man smiled, kicked his horse, and rode on. No words were exchanged, but Thomas understood. The hunter had seen what Thomas had done somehow, had felt the change in the land, the lifting of a weight. Margaret came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Friend of yours?" she asked, watching the hunters disappear down the road. Thomas shook his head. "Just someone who understands," he said. Margaret sat down in the chair next to him, her eyes thoughtful. "You've been here 3 months," she said, "and in all that time, you haven't told me where you came from or what you're running from." Thomas looked at her. This practical, steady woman who'd built a life from the ashes of loss. "I'm not running anymore," he said. "I already faced what was chasing me." She studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "Good," she said. "Because I need a foreman. My last one took off for the gold fields, and I've got more work than I can handle alone. Job pays decent, comes with a cabin, and all the coffee you can drink. Interested?" Thomas felt something warm spread through his chest. It wasn't quite hope. He was too worn out for hope, but it was close. It was possibility. The idea that maybe his life could be more than just surviving, that maybe he could build something instead of just running from things. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'm interested." Winter came and Thomas settled into his new life. He moved into the foreman's cabin, a small but solid structure with a wood stove and a window that looked out over the prairie. He hired 3 good hands, organized the winter work, and found he had a knack for management he hadn't known he possessed. Margaret trusted his judgment, and he found satisfaction in being trusted, in being needed, in being part of something larger than himself. The ranch prospered through the winter, the cattle stayed healthy, and Thomas began to feel something he hadn't felt in years: contentment. He still thought about the skinwalkers sometimes. How could he not? But the memories had lost their sharp edges. They'd become a story he told himself, a thing that had happened to someone who felt distant from the man he was now. He'd faced the darkness, and won, and that victory had changed him in ways he was still discovering. He was more patient now, more willing to listen, less afraid of connection, The people who knew him before, people like Calloway, wouldn't have recognized this version of Thomas Webb. He barely recognized himself. Spring arrived with wild flowers and new calves. The ranch came alive with activity, branding, fence repair, preparing for the summer market. Thomas worked alongside his hands, his shirt soaked with honest sweat, his mind focused on simple, solvable problems. A broken gate, a difficult horse, creek that needed damming, problems with solutions. Not like the impossible thing he'd faced in those cursed hills. These were challenges he could meet with hard work and common sense. And meeting them felt good, felt right, felt like building instead of just surviving. One warm evening in late April, Margaret invited Thomas to dinner in the main house. It was just the two of them, a simple meal of stew and cornbread. They talked about the ranch, about the coming season, about nothing important and everything important. Somewhere during the meal, Thomas realized he was happy. Not the wild, desperate happiness of survival, but the quiet, steady happiness of a life well lived. A life with purpose and connection, and the possibility of tomorrow. It was a feeling he'd thought he'd lost forever in those dark hills. But here it was, found again in the simplest of places. A table, a meal, a conversation with someone who saw him as he was now, not as what he'd been. After dinner, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, and the prairie stretched out before them like a promise. "You never talk about your past," Margaret said quietly, "and I won't pry. But I want you to know, whoever you were before you came here, whatever you did or didn't do, it doesn't matter to me. The man you are now, the man I see every day working this ranch, treating my hands with respect, keeping his word, that's who you are. The rest is just smoke." Thomas felt his throat tighten. He wanted to tell her everything, the calls, the voices, the burning bones, the moment when he'd almost given in. But the words wouldn't come. Some stories were too dark to share in the light, too twisted to speak aloud when the world was this beautiful, this peaceful, this full of ordinary grace. So instead he just said, "Thank you," and she reached over and squeezed his hand, understanding everything he couldn't say. They sat like that as the stars came out, two people who'd both survived their own darknesses, finding comfort in the simple fact of being alive and having each other's company. Summer brought storms and hard work, and moments of beauty so acute they made Thomas's chest ache. A foal being born in the early morning, a thunderstorm rolling across the prairie, the rain smelling of dust and life, a hawk circling overhead, riding the thermal currents. These were the moments he lived for now. Not the big victories or dramatic confrontations, but the small, perfect instants when the world revealed its goodness. When he could feel grateful just to be breathing, just to be here, just to have made it through to the other side of darkness. In July, a letter arrived at the ranch. It was from Father Morrison, forwarded through several addresses before finding Thomas in Kansas. The priest wrote that the hills where the Pritchards had died were changing. Grass was growing where before there'd been only bare rock. Birds were returning. A family of settlers had moved into the valley and built a new homestead, and they reported feeling nothing but peace. The land was healing, Morrison wrote. Whatever curse had been on it was broken. Thomas read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and put it in his dresser drawer. Proof, if he needed it, that what he'd done had mattered, that his suffering hadn't been meaningless. Autumn came again, bringing the familiar cycle of preparation for winter. But this time, Thomas wasn't alone. He had the ranch, he had his work, he had Margaret's steady presence and the respect of the men who worked under him. He'd built something here, not just a job, but a life, a real life, with roots that went deep into the good Kansas soil. He thought sometimes about the man he'd been before, solitary, wary, keeping everyone at arm's length. That man was gone, transformed not by darkness, but by the act of facing it and refusing to let it win. One cold November evening, almost exactly a year after his confrontation in the cave, Thomas sat in his cabin, warming his hands by the stove. Outside, the wind howled. Just wind, not voices. Never voices anymore. And snow was starting to fall. He thought about the Pritchard family, about what they might have been before the skinwalkers took them. A man and woman trying to make a life in hard country. 3 children growing up under big skies. Normal people with normal hopes and normal fears. They hadn't deserved what happened to them. No one did. But at least now they were at rest. At least their suffering had ended. He thought about all the people who might have heard the call and followed it if he hadn't burned those bones. Travelers, settlers, cowboys like himself. How many lives had been saved because he'd found the courage to face his fear? He'd never know the number, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd done it. That when the darkness had called his name, he'd found the strength to resist. And more than that, to fight back, to choose life over the seductive promise of an end to loneliness, to choose the hard, messy, beautiful work of staying human. Margaret knocked on his cabin door around 8 o'clock, bringing him coffee and a slice of pie. "Thought you might want some company," she said. "First snow of the year. Seems like it should be shared." Thomas smiled, stood up, and opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. "I could use the company." She entered, settling into the chair across from him, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the snow fall through the window. Two survivors of different storms, finding warmth in the simple fact of not being alone. They talked late into the night, about the ranch, about the coming winter, about plans for spring. And somewhere in that conversation, without either of them quite saying it out loud, Thomas understood that he'd found what he'd been looking for all along. Not excitement or adventure or escape, just this, a place to belong, people who knew him and valued him, work that mattered, a future that stretched out before him with possibility instead of dread. He'd traveled through hell to get here, had faced things that would have broken most men, but he'd made it. He was here, and here was good. When Margaret finally left, heading back to the main house through the falling snow, Thomas stood in his doorway and watched her go. Then he looked up at the sky, at the snow falling soft and clean from the darkness, covering everything in white, covering the old tracks, the old trails, the old scars, making everything new again. He thought about the wolf howls he'd ignored that night when his mule had been killed. How different everything would have been if he'd listened then. If he'd turned back at the first sign of danger, he never would have faced the skinwalkers, never would have freed their spirits, never would have proven to himself what he was capable of. Sometimes, he thought, the worst things that happen to us are also doorways. Not to happiness, he wasn't naive enough to believe that, but to understanding, to strength, to knowing who we really are when everything else is stripped away. He'd learned that he was someone who could resist the call of the darkness, someone who could face impossible odds and find a way through, someone who chose light even when the darkness promised rest. That knowledge was worth all the suffering it had cost to earn it. Thomas closed his door, locked it against the winter cold, and settled into his chair. He picked up a book Margaret had lent him, something about farming techniques, nothing exciting, and started to read. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but it was just wind. The darkness beyond his window was just darkness. The night was just night. And Thomas Webb, who'd heard his name called by things that shouldn't have voices, who'd burned the bones of skinwalkers in a cursed cave, who'd chosen life when death would have been easier, Thomas Webb was just a man, a foreman on a ranch in Kansas, a man with a past he didn't talk about, and a future he was building one day at a time. And that, he thought as he turned the page of his book, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Sometimes second chances arrive when we least expect them, born from the ashes of our darkest moments. Has a difficult time in your life ever led you somewhere better than you imagined? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this tale touched something in you, subscribe so I can keep sharing more stories like this. Stories about ordinary people who face extraordinary darkness and find their way back to the light. Because that's what we all do, isn't it? We face our wolves, we survive our winters, and we keep walking toward spring. Thank you for listening.